Okay, I guess I'm on. Hojo asked me to talk about sewing and our sewing practice here at ASZC. And I started out writing this long talk, and then I thought, do I really want to listen to that? And my answer was no. So I'm going to start out with some quotes. Um, well, actually, I want to start out first by thanking my teachers, of course, Hojo, my sewing teacher, Karen Wicken, uh, my fellow sewing teacher, Judy, um, Judy Putnam, Yuko Okamura, and I'd like to thank Dean Selkirk, whose book I'm quoting from, and all the other sewing teachers out there that I've met that have helped me along the way. I've only been sewing for about 15 years, which makes me pretty much a baby in the practice. Um, but I am trying to learn as much as I can so that I can help train more teachers and pass along what I know. Yeah. And I'm going to start with the quote. This is from Dogen, Power of the Robe. Listen carefully, Jina Prabha. The great happiness field robe has 10 victorious qualities. While worldly clothes increase defilement, the Dharma robe of the Tathagata does not. The Dharma robe provides modesty, completes repentance, and creates the rice field of happiness. It protects you from cold, heat, and poisonous creatures, and strengthens your way-seeking mind for attaining ultimate understanding. Manifesting the form of a mendicant home leaver, it frees people from greed and desire, cuts off 5 wrong views, and helps you to hold correct practice. By revering and bowing to the sacred banner Kashaya, you will have the happiness of King Brahma. When a Buddha child wears the Kashaya, a vision of a stupa arises, creating happiness, eliminating unwholesomeness, and joining humans and devas. The noble form of the Kasaya arouses respect in a true seeker who is free from worldly dust. All Buddhas praise it as an excellent field, most beneficial to sentient beings. The inconceivable, miraculous power of the Kasaya nurtures practice for enlightenment. The sprout of practice grows in a spring field. The splendid fruit of enlightenment is like a harvest in autumn. The Kasaya is true armor, impenetrable as diamond. The deadly arrows of delusion cannot pierce it. I have now recited the 10 excellent merits of Kasaya. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? According to Dogen, the robe is Buddha Dharma itself. Think about that. Putting on the robe is putting on Buddha Dharma itself. And that is very important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the old history of the robe, the later Japanese history of the robe, and what's going on today in America. And we have to start with the legend of how we have a robe. That is that King Bimbisaya, who was Buddha's patron, was out riding his elephant one day, and he saw what he thought was one of Buddha's followers. So he rode over, got down off his elephant, was going to give him some alms, and then he realized that it was just a Brahmin. I always felt bad for the Brahmin in this story. You know, you're at the top of the food chain, you're walking along, and there's the king. And he sees you, and he's riding over to you, and he gets off his elephant, and then he looks at you and says, "Oh, I thought you were somebody else." You gotta feel for the guy. So the king asked Buddha to design a garment that would distinguish his followers from Brahmins, so he didn't make that same mistake again. And so Buddha asked Ananda to design a robe. He asked Ananda to make it look like rice fields. Now, that's not surprising because the Shakyas were a rice growing tribe. And so that image of the fields with plants and the dikes around it was probably something very familiar to him. Maybe he was a little homesick for that, but that is what we came up with. Okay, now this was to be the robe that distinguished, but not ennobled. So it was to set Buddha's followers apart, but it wasn't supposed to make them exalted. It was supposed to be a humble robe. And so the practice of making robes out of discarded cloth arose. And the legends are that monks would pick up discarded excrement wiping cloths, bandages, grave cloths, cut out the good bits, and then sew them together. So fast forward a bit to the Vinaya, which has a good bit to say about robe. The term Kisaya actually means broken color, and it refers to the colors that the robe were allowed for the robes, which were not to be primary colors, not to be colors that made you stand out, not colors to arouse envy or greed. And so many of these cloths started out as white and then were dyed with tree bark or uh, rusty dirt or something like that to make them sort of a muddy color. We do know that monks were allowed to have a small knife and a needle to take care of their robes. We also know that there were instructions as to construction. For example, these little robes were to have slits in them so that bugs and dirt could fall out. There are a lot of rules about who can wear a robe, what it can be made of. Uh, Cloth chewed by cattle, cloth chewed by mice. We don't do that anymore. But there is one thing that's allowed, and that is cloth that is donated to temples. And that's what we sew with here. Anybody have any questions? Comments? So certainly there were clothes worn under the robe, and as the robe moved north with Buddhism into China, ultimately to Japan, the clothes underneath changed. So the Chinese certainly had um, more clothing under their robes because it was colder there. Okay, and from China we get those robes with the big sleeves that you see, and there are some references to these in oh, let's just leave it that. Anyway, in Transmission of the Lamp, Kazan's book, there are stories from the Tang Dynasty of people putting their sleeve over their head, and the very next story has someone putting his robe over his head. So clearly the robes were there. The story of King Messiah appears in there somewhere. But the robes did change. They became more elaborate. Uh, in many places, silk was used, even though silk was made by killing living beings. Um, More and more of these little vertical rows showed up, and the brocade came into fashion, and the robes became pretty fancy. I'm not sure what robes Dogen saw. If there were places that still had plain robes, and it was only around the courts and the emperor that you saw fancy clothes, we don't really know. But we do know that Dogen has written about how profoundly moved he was when he saw a monk put his robe on his head and recite the robe verse. And he determined that he would take that practice back to Japan with him. And that's what he did. And the monks definitely sewed their own robe. There's a reference somewhere of Dogen grumbling about how he wanted his monks to sew their robe in 3 days because otherwise, when there was work to do and he tried to round them up, they'd all go, "Oh no, we've got to sew our robe," and then they'd slack off with their sewing. Um, we do know that there's a robe. There's a portrait of Dogen that you see that has the robe that's the pattern very much like what we have today with the vertical and the horizontal pieces. But somewhere along the line in Japan, that custom petered out, and excuse me, professional shops sprang up that made robes and rakusu. The rakusu, I've read one reference that says this arose in about the 18th century when monks had to start working, and those big robes were an impediment. So they started wearing these little robes, which they would tie with a belt around their middle. And in some cases, the robe was worn actually on the left shoulder, and some of them were quite large. But
Hey, Jane,
yeah,
do we know if the Rakusu, the miniature robe, was invented in China? Or
well, I have a theory that it arose during the Tang Dynasty um, when there were persecutions and uh, monks had to kind of take to the hills, and so they had to work. And there too, the robe was an impediment. And the other thing is that this is something that you could hide fairly quickly. You could tuck it under your clothes, or you could pull it off um, and stick it under a bush or something. So that's my theory, and I've heard other scholars mention that.
that would be China, not
That would be China, Tang Dynasty. But I've also seen references to where the Rakusu came into use in 18th century Japan. And I'm not enough of a scholar to know which is true.
I don't suspect that the Chinese invented the Zalku as well. Maybe Dogen brought that back, but I'm not sure.
It sounds right, but we know the Chinese was definitely into robes. We talk about Huineng and his robe that nobody could pick up, and there are many, many references to passing on the robe and the bowl. So,
Chinese were very inventive.
hmm?
Culturally, the Chinese were very inventive
Yeah.
historically.
So anyway, so this custom died out until about 1910. A group of nuns approached Sawaki Koto and talked to him about sewing. They wanted to sew their own vestments. He got very interested in sewing. He sewed his own okesa and um, started teaching others. Now he and here's where I need my notes. Milwaukee Roses said, wearing the case is being zazen. This is to arrive at wherever you were headed. He maintained that the sitting in the okesa was all that you needed to do. Then there was another teacher named Hashimoto-san, Hashimoto Sensei, who also took up the sewing practice. And this is where my knowledge gets a little bit fuzzy. But I know the dog ate my homework. But they each had students who came to America. And they said, like, put it in here. Okay. Uchiyama was Sawaki's disciple, and we are in the Uchiyama lineage. Okay. Hodo Sawaki had a disciple who was also a sewer who came to San Francisco in late 80s, early 90s, somewhere there. And she taught sewing, and she taught sewing. Her name was Joshin, and there was another teacher named, boy, there were two teachers. Okay. Sawaki's student, they taught with Blanche Hartman and the San Francisco people. The other Hashimoto student worked with Tomoe Katagiri. And Karen Wicken, my teacher, is Katagiri, is Tomoe-san's heir. So actually, we here sew in the Hashimoto tradition, while San Francisco sews in the Uchiyama tradition, which is a little bit scrambled, but that's the way it is, and nobody particularly cares. Okay. Sorry, I messed that part up. Um, and it's the history that we have sewing teachers in mostly on the West Coast. There are a few up north. I'm about the only one in the Southeast, and we really need more sewing teachers. So think about it, people out there. The last thing on my list of things to talk about was why sew. Why sew? You can buy a rakusu. You can buy a robe. One, is it still Buddha's robe, or is there something different about having sewn it yourself? Well, I submit that there is. You know, the word sutra means thread, the same root as our word suture. And when we sew with that thread, we're threading the sutra. We're connecting to those monks that sat under trees with their little penknife and their little needle and their Pumsbula scrap fabric, sewing together a robe. We're sewing with the Chinese masters. We're sewing with Dogen. We're sewing with his students. We are part of that thread that connects us straight from the Buddha to the Buddhas of the future. That's an important thing. And sewing is not easy. It is in some ways harder than doing Zazen. Because you can sit and do Zazen and your mind can wander and nobody will ever know. But if you're sitting and sewing and your mind wanders, it'll show and you'll know it. And you'll be able to look at that forever and say, this is where my mind wandered. This is where I was angry. So it requires a great deal of concentration. And it requires a great deal of work. Cherry Zimmer and I once calculated that you need more than 20,000 stitches to make an okitsa. That's a lot of stitches. And that's why I think sewing is important. Comments? Questions?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I see a thread from the earlier Dharma talk about homeless Kodo, because I believe we talked about him, and then now you mentioned the nun that worked with homeless Kodo, and I kind of see that threaded throughout
Mm-hmm.
as far as the Dharma talks are concerned. So, thank you.
It's all threads. We talk about the blood vein, and when you get a Dharma name, you get this little paper called the Kechi Miyaku, called the blood vein, and it's got the line through all the Buddhas to India and China and Japan to you. And that too is a thread. So yes, we're all threaded together.
Chico-san, can you do the gallery view?
Oh, this is great.
Carola,
Yeah.
when they get that fixed.
I need to put my glasses on for this.
I was a fiber artist until the 90s and working in handwork quilting and such things, embroidery and handwork quilting. And recently went to a quilt exhibit at the High Museum of Art here in Atlanta. The difference between the focus and the work of the handwork and the machine work that is now done for fiber art. You almost feel the energy from even now from the old quilts that have been done, and the creativity of using the pieces that you found from the flour sacks and the old dresses and everything that they would use to create incredible pieces of art. It's a pleasure to look at the work close on with the very tiny, even stitches that women mostly did by hand with the quilts. And the same thing of watching. I haven't taken part in Carola's classes, but I have watched the students and her work together, and it's been wonderful to watch. Thank you.
Thank you. With each stitch, one internally recites Namu Kiebutsu. I take refuge in Buddha. I take refuge in Buddha. I take refuge in Buddha. And when you sit and sew for long enough and take enough refuge, that becomes a very profound experience. And to do that with other people is also a very profound experience. That's
Moko,
Hello, hello, Carola. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you and to hear you. I have two questions. One was, what was the name of the first book that you quoted from? I didn't catch it.
and first quote. It was
No,
from
the name of the book.
this is called Buddha's Robe is Sewn.
Okay.
It's written by Gene Selkirk, and you can buy it through, I think, the Berkeley Zen Center. She sort of runs an organization called the Zen Buddhist Sewing Teachers,
Oh, that's
VBST.
great. Yep. And the other question I have, I'm very curious, what is it like to be a sewing teacher? When I sewed my Rakusu, it was during COVID. Karen Wiccan was my teacher, and we did it on Zoom. And I just wonder, what is it like to be a sewing teacher?
Mhm. That's a really good question. It's like being a sewing teacher. And sometimes you're a bully, and sometimes you're a sweetie, and sometimes you have to say, "This is no good, take it apart." Um, I think watching people sew is one of the most humbling things I've ever done. That watching the effort that people put into, not everybody is built to make beautiful, even stitches. That doesn't matter because you're not sewing to arouse that greed or envy. You're sewing to relate to the Buddha. So every rakusu that is finished is beautiful and perfect. And the effort that everybody makes is perfect. Now, people might look at it, and I've had people say, oh, this is, it's not true. You know, one of the things we used to say in Kyoto is if your stance is correct and your breathing is correct and your concentration is correct, you might not hit the target, but you will not have missed. And that's the same thing with the Rakusu. Your stitches are crooked, your lines are a little crooked. It's not a perfect in some abstract sense, but you have hit the target. And another thing that we teachers say together is if at the end of all this sewing, all you have is a rakusu, there's something terribly wrong.
I'm so glad I asked the question. Thank you so much.
Anybody else? Put everybody to sleep? Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, Carola. Good evening. So good to see you. Thank you for joining us. I talked a little bit earlier today about Kodo Sawaki and tried to help kind of make sure people knew a little more about him. Wonderful individual. What I really found interesting was that he influenced a lot of people. Of course, Uchiyama, but Deshimaru, he was a big influence on Deshimaru, uh, and uh, and many other teachers. But he transmitted like 4 or 5 women sewing teachers, and
Mm-hmm.
I found that really very, very interesting indeed. And I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how long the sewing tradition sort of went dormant? How long was that period? And were maybe some people doing it still, and that's what kind of kept it alive? Or what are your thoughts about that?
I think some people must have been sewing. No, I don't have a good idea of um, when it started petering out, and probably somebody's brother-in-law owned a kimono shop and suddenly, they switched their business there. Um, and there are still shops. In fact, almost all of these that come from Japan are machine made with great reverence from what I've read. And there are also lay groups that meet a couple of times a year and sew rakusu for lay ordinations. So it had to be laying there somewhere because certainly the Vinaya does not have the directions for how to do this.
Yeah.
Was that a question in the chat that somebody had?
I usually put the reference for
Yeah, that was WorldCat is a great resource to look for books, the nearest library that may have your book. So I put that link to the book that Carola Sensei mentioned today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So any other comments?
I do have a follow-up if I can. I know that my understanding was that, and I think this is what you expressed, Koto Sawaki was approached by women uh,
Hmm.
to and to get his support in
Exactly.
in helping rebirth, and I think it was a great ally in that regard. I don't know. It'd be fun to hear some stories about that, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
About the interaction, and I don't know if you've heard any such things, but it's a wonderful thing.
I have not heard much, but soon to be published is um, Yuko Okamura's translation of a study of the Kesa, compiled by Eijun Carola, supervised by Kodo Sawaki, and translated by Kuan Franz and Yuko Okamura. This is going to be open PDF online that anybody can read. Um, I was lucky enough to be part of a seminar that discussed the translation as it was going forward. Um, It's a lovely book that
Great.
has a lot of, not enough detail to satisfy me, not enough stories, but it has some. And
Okay.
it has a lot of technical details about construction. And it also has uh, a chapter on the care and feeding of your robes.
Hmm.
You know, technically people were supposed to have 3 robes. The five row robe, which is turned into the Rakusu. The 7 row kesa for everyday wear, and then the 9 row kesa for special occasions. Most of us don't have that anymore. And you were supposed to have them with you all the time. And one thing that came into practice when train travel became more prevalent in Japan and carrying 3 robes around became kind of a pain is what they call shosanis, which are little tiny okesa, little miniature okesa. And many of them are quite beautiful. And so you could still be carrying the 3 robes, but you don't have to carry a tablecloth with you. And this points out one of the things about Zen practice is that it's always got a very practical side and the really profound side. The profound and the mundane always meet somewhere. And so a lot of what goes on with the robe is very mundane. You know, these days we get polyester blend. Um, since it's supposed to be used cloth, I donate it to the temple. I took it out in the backyard, lay it in the dirt, and jump up and down on it. And then I wash it. Um, I mix a little bit of bleach in the water so that the color is not pure black. And then we're off. Your cases should be kept in a bag on a high place. And some things I learned is one, the original case was supposed to cover your navel and your knees. So it should come down at least to below your knees. And you don't sit on your okesa ever. You pull it up, your butt goes on your bowing cloth, your zagu. You don't sit on the okesa. And it should never touch the ground. Same thing for this. You don't do prostrations with this unless you can somehow tuck it into your robe to keep it from touching the floor. And floor to me is, or ground is anywhere where feet go. To wash your kesa, you boil water and then scent it with incense. Dunk your kesa. You never wring it. And then you drape it over a white rod and let it dry. And then you fold it and put it on the altar and walk around it 9 times. And then you and your kesa are back together again. That's a story.
I have, nobody else has something. I have something I'd like to ask you to talk about or speculate on. It's more toward the social context. Like, if you had an outfit, you could be a Roshi too. So if Okamura Roshi once said, "Who are we?" Tell someone they cannot wear the Buddha's robe. So from our perspective, it's very clear. First of all, as you said it, I've talked before, we wear these vestments for the sake of others,
Mm-hmm.
not just for ourselves. And Matsuoka Roshi would have us robe up whenever we appeared in public with him because he said that's the way Zen looks. That's what people expect to see. That show up in zoot suits, it would be demeaning to presentation. So the question I have is, the robe can send a signal. The robes can hide a lot of sins, as we all know. The robe can send a signal that unless you have a robe, your practice is not genuine. Remember, Les Rio came and gave a talk, and Fred and the others got upset with him because he seemed to be implying that you have to have the robe for your practice to be genuine. It was all confusion, but what do you say to that where the public impression and the fact that we're a householder emphasis, at least in much of our presentation, and even the existence of something called a priest in householders in this seems like a lead balloon, an anomaly.
Yeah.
So how do you see all that working in future Zen in America?
Well, I don't think you need any special clothes to meditate. Oh yeah, that's categories for tomoes. Um, Buddha mostly intended for his teachings to be for householders, not people living in a monastery. And what do householders need with this? Certainly in Japan, pilgrims wear wagesa a lot of the times, but there's no reason at all to criticize someone for not having robes. And as to the first part of your question, that anybody can put on a robe, remember the robe comes to you from your teacher. You sew the robe and then you give it to your teacher, and if you deserve it, then you get it back. The Vinaya is pretty clear about that. It has lots of circumstances under which your robe can be taken away, and who can wear the robe, who can't. Um, but we don't have Zen police that come and bust you for wearing a robe um, without authorization. So uh, the directions are online. The actual mechanics of sewing a rakusu are not rocket science. Okay? The teaching of it is not how big to cut the pieces and where to pin them. The teaching is in understanding that you're getting the rakusu because you're asking to receive the precepts. And the rakusu is the precepts. The rakusu is the Buddha Dharma. The rakusu is the Buddha himself. And so, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to wrap yourself up in an old sheet and call it uh, an okesa, I don't care. I'm not going to come criticize anybody. Now, we do have something called Nyoho A. Nyo means with, Ho means Dharma, Namukyeho, and A means clothing. So Nyoho A refers to clothing that is made in accordance with the Dharma and that is right with the Vinaya and the accepted tradition. And so, um, not all robes and not all rakusu are Nyoho, but Cook County.
Your favorite version of the robe verse, and then for those who don't know you, you are a physician, you're a physicist, and you were in charge of the Muang labs, I understand it.
I was in charge of the undergraduate physics lab. And to answer your question, teaching sewing is a whole lot like teaching physics labs. Some people can measure better than others. Some people can follow directions better than others. Some need a little more help.
I think it's an interesting phenomenon that you're a scientist, and yet for somebody who doesn't know that and they see you doing this ancient tradition of sewing, they might think you're some kind of throwback to an earlier age, but you're as modern.
Who says I'm not?
Well, you are, but as modern as it can get at the same time. Similarly, Jiko is a library scientist, and she's practicing Zen and working for the SCBA and so forth. So it's kind of interesting. You might think that somebody so advanced in studies would have very little interest in something as arcane as medieval sewing.
Oh,
You know,
it would be sad to hear that. So, any other comments or questions?
Chin, did you have your hand up? There it is.
Yeah, Tisha. Yeah, you.
The last, the point you made just a moment ago is echoed in our robe chant. Great robe of liberation, a formless field of merit. So it seems like even if we're not wearing any cloth that we've sewn, we are walking wrapped in our our own karma or our own actions. And just like you said, the Rakusu stitches perfect. You said every Rakusu is perfect, and I would interpret that as that Rakusu perfectly reflects the state of mind and the situation when the person was sewing it. And just like the Rakusu has to reflect the state of mind of the person sewing, seems like also where you said you can daydream when you're zazen, nobody will know. But it seems like your body language will be shouting pretty loudly that you're daydreaming.
Well, if you're daydreaming sewing, your needle shouts it pretty loud. Um, my version of the robe actually comes from Shasta Abbey. How great and wondrous the close of enlightenment, formless yet embracing every treasure. I wish to unfold the teachings of Buddha, save all beings. And I like that. Carol, you know that one too, don't you? And
We used to chant that.
yeah, we did. And it came from Shasta Abbey, and then we got different. I think we started using Kumura-san's.
Most of the influence now is from AHG. A lot of Matsuoka's teaching on protocol is from Sojiji. And so even Sojiji and AHG are different.
Yeah, I mentioned the Hashimoto and the Sawaki traditions. I'm hearing stories that there may be as many as 3 other Nyohei traditions somewhere in America. I don't know where. And maybe my my friends and I are trying to compile sort of a directory of sewing teachers so that we can support each other. And just like teachers, we do have horror stories about students. Um, and we can help each other out. I've helped people um, that sew in the Sawaki tradition. Um, I've helped people that sew in other traditions. I've sewn for people who, uh, for some reason, are physically unable to sew for themselves. Either they can't see or they have arthritis. I sort of did a business for a while sewing brown rakusu for Zen masters with arthritis on the West Coast. And I've sewn for people going through cancer treatments. Yeah, you have your hand up, sitting next to Jerry.
Cushion. Cushion.
Yeah, you.
Yes, thank you. Carola Sensei, I thank you for your comments. And what struck me as you were talking about threading, we're all threaded together, which we are. When I was sewing my okesa, the other thing I found was I was sewing stories into the cloth, stories of where I was at that moment, that day, those stitches, stories with Karin, my teacher, for months, stories that included you because you added some important stitching to my okesa when we were finishing it up. And so I imagine you also carry the wisdom of so many stories by advancing this tradition and helping so many of us. Maybe you could speak to that, and deep bows for all you have done for many of us.
I think you're dead on when you talk about sewing the story into the robe. When I sewed my okesa, my father was dying. And you can sort of see in some places the sorrow, and in some places the anger, and in some places just the confusion of dealing with that. And every Rakusu, every okesa is your practice at that time. It does tell your story. And unlike some teachers, I don't believe that a group should go in dead silence. You know, so if someone wants to speak, I do ask that they put the work down so they're not, it's not a quilting bee, but that we listen and think and then resume our sewing. Okay. And I do restrict it to the practice. I don't want to hear how about them Braves or something. Um, or I don't care about football or something. Um, so we do need to be talking about our practice, but amazing stories happen and amazing little flashes of enlightenment happen too when people are sewing.
How many times have you pricked your finger with a needle?
Oh, I have sewn my fingers to the robe a couple of times. Um, they develop a little callus right here where the needle goes in. But if I sew something for someone, I have a money back guarantee that every piece will contain a bit of my blood and at least one Saluki hair.
That's an interesting point. In the traditional way, it's the perfection imperfection thing again. When you finish an okesa, it used to be the teacher, I think, would prick his finger, put a spot of blood right at the top of the nape of the neck of the robe, which would ruin it, so it wouldn't be perfect. And I think Okamura Roshi took a red pen and put a dot on mine.
um, I know from Vinaya times, spots were put on the robe to help people distinguish their robe from other people's, and that has carried on. And I have heard of that blood spot on the shoulder um, as well, and that too is the bloodline transmission. It's part of the thread.
Blood, your teacher's blood.
Your teacher's blood to you, your blood to your student's blood. So, yeah, I do bleed a bit on stuff that I
I'd like to hear from Landon here. I think Landon is a young guy, and this may seem a little strange to him. I'm not sure.
I love hearing your story, and to be honest, I never really hear much about sewing. I mean, I'm on the cusp of being Gen Z, I'm at the cusp of the end of being Gen Z, and I feel like this is an art that's never like just talked about much. So I
well,
appreciate you bringing it.
a lot of places don't. A lot of places still buy their kazoo from Japan. There's catalogs, and I tell some people just do not want to sew. And I say, well, there's catalogs, you can buy them. We do not discriminate against people who want to sew or who want to buy. Now, if you get one from Japan, it'll have a ring, and that's kind of the mark of a commercially made rakusu.
This one.
Yeah, I have the patterns for making a ring, but I discourage it highly. If you go to a heiji, you gotta have a ring. And so if you're a heiji and they're taking pictures, they'll hunt up a rakusu for you to wear with a ring so you don't stick out. But
Another thing you should be aware of at AHG, first time we went there in 1989, Oliver Bjorkstone and I were there, and Matsunaga, who was head of the English speaking department at that time, the last day we were there, we had a little chocolates and tea party in his office in his room. And he looked at our rakusus and he said, those are very high ranking. So Oliver immediately took them off and put them in a room and said, no, that's okay, you're Americans.
Or those big dumb gaijin.
But you should be aware that Rakusu is, depending on the color, I suppose, and various aspects of them, in the Japanese hierarchy, and Kanzan may know a little bit more about this than I do. They represent rank within the structure of the monastic order there. I think it was almost necessary to establish that because you'd have hundreds of monks and nuns in one place, and so you had to have some kind of structure.
When you get to be abbot for a day at Heiji, you get a red robe, a red rakusu. I mean, fire engine red. Kind of neat.
Womb of the Tathagata Garbha.
When there's, in addition to the rag robe and the cut up whole cloth robe, there's a sort of mythical robe too that is the golden robe of Maitreya that is being saved for her when she finally appears.
Buddha of future.
Yeah, Buddha yet to come. And I've sewn on some robes for teachers who obviously are ready for some very gold robes. What else do I have to say?
I have one for you. I've always thought of the robe, the okesa. The rakusu is a miniature version of the okesa. So the rakusu is pointing at the okesa. And the okesa, my view of it, is pointing at the Nirmanakaya, the transformation body, your birthday suit, in other words. So we're all born in the robe. And when you get to that point in your practice and you make the robe symbolizes the Nirmanakaya, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, the true robe of Buddha.
That's very well put. Very well. And one of the points I wanted to make was that the robe should distinguish but not elevate. So it should always be something humble. It should always be something that does not arouse envy or jealousy.
Tell them about your Home Depot apron.
Oh yeah, and I maintain that the Rakusu is like the Home Depot apron. Says, ask me, I'm here to help. And that is what it should symbolize. That we're here to serve others. We're here to that we've taken vows that we put on this road and said we wanted to help enlighten all beings, help save all beings.
So we need to introduce the orange robe. The orange.
Yeah, I have heard stories of a rainbow rakusu that was made in California, and some people do make artistic robes as presentations. When I first started sewing, I was really honored to help sew a 27-row okesa that was to be presented to Okamura. And they sent me pieces and I sewed them together and they went back. It was like the fabric was bamboo and the thread was silk. Oh man, that was so much fun to sew. And all 27 strips were put together and presented to him. You don't see him wear it, but still.
As a physicist, you should be able to tell us what would be the maximum number of rows possible for a normal size human being.
Maximum number of.
How small were the 27 patches?
Oh, they were about this wide.
2.5 inches.
Yeah, something like that. It was a long time ago.
So what is the maximum number of rows one could sew?
I don't know. Depends on how small your needle is, I guess.
You have to be an odd number, right?
Yeah.
Odd.
Yeah, there's always an odd number of rows. According to tradition, you stop at 27. Notice that a 5-row robe will have 2 panels. The 7-row will have 3 panels. And the 9-row has 4 panels. There's-
4x9 is 36, and
Yeah, there's lots of panels there. The short panels, there's always a short panel and a long panel. The long panels represent wisdom, and the short panels represent ignorance. And so you always want to have more wisdom than ignorance in your robe, but there's always some ignorance in there. Any other comments? Yeah, Tisha.
At one point, the different affiliates from our lineage each sewed a strip of a okesa, and then they were all put together and given to Abbot Elliston.
Yeah, that's right. I worked on that robe.
Yeah.
So he's got several robes. We have a collection of machine-made robes that belong to Matsuoka. Some of them are not quite rectangular. They have like a flap that goes over the shoulder. Most of them have.
the machine ones came from another disciple in the lineage. The only one that I know that we have in Matsuoka's is that ancient brown one. We have the matching zagu bowing cloth. You might talk about the bowing cloth a little bit,
Okay. Um,
but I think it's hand sewn.
the bowing cloth?
The old one, the old robe.
I don't think so. Yeah, but these robes had Velcro so that they wouldn't fall off. If you've worn a robe, you know that every time you lean over, it tries to lock. Well, these guys cheated and put Velcro, and so that you could do. Um, so Hojo wants me to talk about the bowing cloth. Um, the bowing cloth. It's cloth. Uh, it has a dirty side and a clean side. And it's always folded with the dirty sides together. It sits between the ground and your okesa. Okay. You wear it on your sleeve, but it does not touch the robe. And you do not put the bowing cloth, the zagu, in the same bag as the okesa because the cloth is dirty. I know, I see you holding your head, and I've been trying to design a bag that you could put the two in with compartments or something, but no, they have to be separate because Buddha's robe never touches the dirt. It can be dirty, but it's never defiled.
This is the robe that Bill Sane, he's in California, sent. But this is the one that has the flap,
Yeah,
and it's a brocade. And when Matsuoka Roshi came in 1983 and did my first informal transmission ceremony, he gave me this zagu, this bowing cloth to use. Because in the ceremony, you put your bowing cloth down, and then your teacher puts his down on top of yours, and then at one point you reverse them. He puts his down, you put yours on top of his. That's one of the things. And you can see how I don't know if you can see this, but how the area where the fingers go is completely worn through. So he must have used this bowing cloth an awful lot. And when Bill sent this to me, I recognize it's the matching robe for the bowing cloth that Sensei let me use and had left here. I don't know if he forgot it or if he left it on purpose. I think that's hand sewn.
yeah, this one is so.
And so
This is a very precious object.
you want to talk about this patch cloth in the middle?
Oh,
But has to be here.
then you take that and hold it. Okay, let me.
Okay.
Okay. May I touch the cloth? Okay.
Okay. Kanju means
Yeah.
residual instant.
Mhm.
Each metal sheet.
Cloth has a center part called the kigami and a homemade one. And that's why this one is a little confusing. There's a piece in the middle called the teko. And that traditionally is fabric that your teacher gives you. Since early on, we pretty much denuded Hojo's wardrobe. People would do things like go to Goodwill and buy an old shirt. Um, it has to be thin fabric. It has to be dark fabric. It has to have no pattern and no pattern in the weave. Very plain fabric. These all have four corners. And this too is part of the practicality of Zen. These have, these represent the four deities, the four directions, all kinds of four things. They're also where your thumb goes when you're laying them down. And so this is something that kind of is easy to replace. And if it wears out from your thumb, it's quite easy to fix. So it's just yet another one of those things that is both profound and mundane.
The seven joke.
And that's the seven joke. Yes. That is silk.
Yeah. Good, thank you.
Mhm. Okay. There we go. So, yes, it's folded dirty sides together. So if you have like a Karoma, what you would do is put this on the robe and then fold the robe back over it so that it doesn't touch your kesa. Now, why? Well, when you're wearing the okesa, you can't slouch around. You have to be, and if you've worn one, you know how if you lean forward, it pulls off, flaps open. Um, you have to be very mindful of your movement wearing the robe. And that's just another help in our mindfulness.
You can also mention also that the floors were hard packed earth in those days. One reason you didn't want to touch the ground, that floor.
Yeah. Or you were sitting out in the woods.
You didn't have a washing machine and dryer to throw it in.
I think Smyer Sensei had a question. Did Smyer Sensei, did we address your question?
I just wanted to say that I found this really interesting. When I used to live in Chicago, this was, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. The university, the Art Institute of Chicago, they, lo and behold, I was at the Art Institute looking at some art, and I wound up going into this room where they had all kinds, it was a collection of okesas, and that somehow somebody there had accumulated. Maybe people gifted them to them. Maybe they didn't know what to do with them after somebody died. But it was really fascinating. Many of them were plain, but some were quite ornate. But there was a lot of variations in the pattern and the style of the period, and they had some commentary about it. Or as you went around saying that this developed because of this, and I just found it really interesting. But some of them were quite ancient. I think most of them were from Japan. Just really
Yeah,
interesting.
they're Chinese. Um, the San Francisco Textile Museum hosted a lecture some years back, and he showed some specimens that were from like 7th and 8th century
Yeah.
that were silk and some of them were quite elaborate. Um, I guess people would save the fancy silk ones more than they would save the plain cotton.
Right. Right.
You know, so I think there's probably a bias in got um what got preserved and what didn't. Um, I wonder if they can actually date these by style. Like in Europe, you can date calligraphy by the style.
Hmm. Hmm. There were definitely various styles as you went through this collection, and they for different reasons. And I kind of got the impression that they were part of the permanent collection at that Chicago Art Institute. So interesting.
When I was in San Francisco, they had an exhibition of Chinese silk that I didn't get to go to, but the people I was with went and found it very impressive. So there is apparently quite a lot of that very old silk still around. Any other comments? Nope.
Carola, just going back, it's a small thing about the quilting tradition too. They would have the tradition of making sure it was imperfect, and sometimes the blood would be on the quilts as well. So it's a tradition that somehow goes across cultures as well.
Well, the Muslim carpet weavers always deliberately put a flaw into because to make something perfect is to insult Allah, who alone is perfect. So somehow that idea of deliberate non-perfection is it seems to be an old and pretty well ingrained idea. Of course, what exactly is perfection? If by perfection you just mean even strictly, by perfection do you mean the chanting was good, the sewing was mindful? So exactly what is the perfection? To me, all cases are perfect.
They're in the moment. They're made in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, they're a record of your practice at that time. So, are we done? Should we do the four great vows?
I don't know what's
Or are there more speakers after me?
No, after you, it's pretty much zazen. So
I'm the closing
I
act.
believe you are.
Okay. Well, who wants to get the what happened to Hojo?
Then later, if you want to take a look at my book, I'll show you more about the son people. It was fun.
I have to do everything.
I could have done it.
You
Okay.
don't have to take over.
Yeah, right. You do not have my permission to die. Okay. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, Carola.
Remember the Greek chant, however innumerable all beings are?
Hmm?
However innumerable all beings are, we